Wow. Look at that giant. There you go. If you want to catch big bass, throw yourself a crankbait. When it comes to the world of fishing lures, there's probably not a more vast array of baits than crankbaits. Sizes that just in themselves can be overwhelming. Here we've got this little tiny finesse crankbait to this great big magnum crankbait and everything in between. Let's take a look at the 3 categories of crankbaits that I would recommend if you're getting started. That would be your square bill crankbaits, crankbaits that have just a small bill to them, your lipless crankbaits that have 0 lip to them, or your shallow to medium diving crankbaits, or in that medium depth range of the water column. These are the 3 best categories. One, probably because they're the simplest for rod and line selection, and 2, for the depth of water that you're fishing. Typically, if you're a beginner to bass fishing, you're fishing from 0 to, let's say, 10 feet of water. So that's where you get started. Those are the baits that you want to look at. Okay, this is the XPS Crankin' 8. You know, great little setup, throw it on like 12-pound test. And this is something we want to fish in roughly 8 foot of water. Crankin' 8 means it runs about 8 foot deep. So we can manipulate that a little bit by how we hold our rod. If I hold my rod tip higher, I can keep it, you know, maybe at 6 or 7 foot of water, or if I were to go to heavier line. But typically, when you read about crankbaits a certain depth, it's usually based around 10 or 12 pound line. So, you know, this is a great setup. This Crankin' 8, we've got a thermocline here at 9 foot. So this thing should go right above that thermocline. Work it right down this edge. On a crankbait, a good steady retrieve's great. A lot of times it just does, you know, it just basically swims, mimicking the bait fish. And you know, with this thing going to 8 foot, Crankin' 8 means you're fishing in that 6 to 8 foot range, and you're trying to keep the bait touching the bottom in that depth of water. So before we get into how to use a crankbait, let's look at kind of what a crankbait is designed to do. So most crankbaits, other than a lipless, and we'll get to that, has a bill to it. And what I mean by a bill is a plastic bill. That's how the bait cuts through the water. Lipless crankbaits don't float, but the rest of your crankbaits typically float. And what that bait does is you'll make a long cast, it hits the water, it floats, and then based on the size of that bill, that creates drag in the water. So the bigger the bill, the deeper the bait's going to dive. So this thing's going to hit the water. That bill's going to basically be under the surface of the water. And when you start to reel that bait and create that drag, and that bill is going to dig through the water and cause that bait to vibrate and swim down to whatever desired depth. That's all based on the size of the bill and the size line you use. Let's start with a lipless crankbait. A lipless crankbait has no lip to it. Now, the only difference is these baits sink, but these baits are designed to throw it out there, hits the water, and you start retrieving it back. You reel it back. So while this doesn't have a visible bill, it still has a flat surface up here on the nose, and the thin design of it creates a vibration in the water. So when you throw this thing out there and start to reel it, it will vibrate in the water, cause it to rattle, make noises, and also mimic a bait fish or a crawfish going through the water. So this bait, what you do is you throw it out there. If I'm gonna fish super shallow water, mimicking smaller bait fish, I'm gonna use a smaller bait like this. I'm gonna throw it out there. It's gonna hit the water, and I'm gonna start my retrieve. And this bait's gonna vibrate as I reel it back. If I pause it, the bait will fall and sometimes trigger a strike that way. Lipless crankbaits are a great wintertime and springtime bait. Anytime you're trying to mimic a shad or crawfish is predominantly when they're used. They're great around submergent vegetation. Lipless crankbaits are a bait that you definitely want in your tackle box because they're very versatile and they catch great big bass as well. So next, let's look at my favorite category by far. It's the square bill crankbait. These things are super easy. They catch big bass and they work no matter where you're at in the country. Square bill crankbaits are exactly what they say is they have a square bill to them. Basically, all your square bills are made to fish 0 to 5 feet deep. It's based on kind of the size of the bait and the size line you use, but predominantly these baits are used with 15 to 20 pound line, and you're fishing them in 0 to 5 feet of water. The big thing to remember with crankbaits is is matching your hatch. That's what we always say, is if you're fishing an area where you think the fish are feeding on shad, you're using baits that mimic a bait fish, a shad of some sort. If they're feeding on crawfish, a bait that mimics a crawfish. And then sometimes there's colors that really don't mimic anything, but the way you work these baits, you're working them by really, really fast. And bass are kind of like we as humans are. This doesn't look like anything a bass eats, but I'll tell you what, if this is in the candy store and it looks good to us, so we're going to try it. So I think that's a lot with the same for fish too. But the neat thing about square bills are you throw them out and you'll wind them in. And basically this thing's going to dive down in the water. It's going to make some vibration. And the whole key to this thing is you want it bouncing along the bottom. So if you're new to beginning to fishing, you're typically fishing that 0 to 5 feet of water. So fish a square bill crankbait in 0 to 5 feet of water, and you're going to catch a lot of bass. Next on the list, medium diving crankbaits. And what's kind of funny is I've got two different baits here that are definitely not the same size, but what it means by medium is the size bill on it. So the way these bills are designed, they're designed to be medium divers, probably 5 feet to 10 foot deep. Winter and summertime structures would be medium depths, 5 to 10 foot depth ranges. And that's where your medium diving crankbaits come into play. Same thing, just like the square bills is, there's a variety of colors to match your hatch, whether it's crawfish or shad or bluegill, or even that chartreuse and blue looking fish. But there's one thing about a crankbait, a chartreuse and blue one doesn't match any forage out there, but it's a great color selection. The whole key is keeping that bait in that depth range. You're going to take this bigger bill bait, you're going to make a long cast with it, and that bigger bill is going to allow that bait to dive to the bottom, to get to the bottom sooner in that depth range. So a bigger bill with the retrieve of your rod is going to get down to those depths. When I'm fishing a crankbait, I kind of like to know the depth of the shoreline that I'm fishing. Obviously, if the shoreline is steeper and deeper, you need to use a deeper diving bait. One of the big keys with fishing a crankbait is keeping it in contact with the bottom or the vegetation, whatever you're fishing. So, and the other big thing is keeping the boat at a 45-degree angle from the bank. You want this bait to just kind of slowly, as the bank tapers down, you want that bait diving and digging and just kind of touching the bottom to get the best results. If it's too deep of a diver, then it's just digging in the bottom, and then you don't get the best results. You want one that's just ticking the bottom, and then I can use my rod. I can use my rod tip high to keep the bait high in the water, or I can lower my rod tip to get the bait to go a few feet deeper. Like that. See, we just got up here parallel to this bank. Let that crankbait just work down along the side of it. And he ate it. So there you have it. I mean, it's a great way to cover water, find fish. You're able to fish fast, and fishing a crankbait is one of the best ways, I think, to consistently catch fish around the country. And another thing about it is it catches fish in the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter. The line size matters as well. So when you're using a medium diving crankbait, somewhere in the 10 to 14 pound range, and this bait's going to get you down to that optimal depth. So there it is. The three easiest categories as a beginner would definitely be your lipless crankbaits, your square bill crankbaits, and your medium diving crankbaits. If you're new to beginning fishing, stick with these basics. Something else to talk about that's very important when it comes to crankbaits is line selection and rod and reel selection. You can see how my rod's bending here. It's really important to have a good parabolic bend, because as you can see, they like to jump a lot. And if you have a real stiff rod with a crankbait, it'll pull out of their mouths. But as you can see, we got him hooked good. Actually, that back treble hook got him with both. So line is very important, and I try to keep it simplified, is to get the maximum depth out of a bait. A good all-around is probably 14 to 15 pound line. And that's what I like about your lipless and your square bills. Typically, I tell people on your lipless crankbaits, 15 to 20 pound line. Same thing with square bills, 15 to 20 pound line. Shallow, medium diving crankbaits, I say 10 to 15, so 15 pound line is good. So here's something to remember on that is when your baits are diving, if I hold my rod tip high and I'm retrieving it, that bait's only going to be allowed to dive so much because my rod tip's high. So your line is creating drag in the water. So by having my rod tip high, the bait's not getting as deep. So if I want my bait shallower, I hold my rod tip high. But if I want that bait to get a couple feet deeper, all I need to do is hold my rod more towards the water, and that will allow that bait to dive even deeper. So you can control the depth of your bait by just a couple feet by how you hold your rod, and using a 12 pound line over a 15 pound line is going to get an extra foot or two either side of that. So when it comes to crankbaits, remember, it can be overwhelming, but keep it simple. Lipless crankbaits, square bills, shallow to medium. And remember, your bill is what determines the depth of the water that you fish. So figure out what water depth you're fishing. If you're fishing on the bank, keep it shallow. The deeper you go, the bigger the bill you want to use. So next time you're going out fishing, and if you want to expand your knowledge and techniques with fishing, be sure to get you some crankbaits and get out there and put them to work.